Jonathan Eig's King, A Life is the first major biography in decades of the civil rights icon Martin Luther King Jr., and the first to include recently declassified FBI files. The New York Times Review called it the new definitive biography, and worthy of its subject. His other biographies include Ali, A Life, winner of the PEN America Literary Award, the bestseller Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig, winner of the Casey Award, and Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season. His book, The Birth of the Pill, will soon be staged as a play by Chicago's Timeline Theater. He is also a former senior writer for the Wall Street Journal. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Eig to the Free Library.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I'm sorry that Mark couldn't be with us tonight, and you're going to be stuck with me for the solo act. Laura said to me, well, you wrote 600 pages. You can probably fill 30 minutes on your own, and I guess I can. I begin the book by saying that on December 5th, 1955, a young black man became a founding father of the United States of America. The place was Montgomery, Alabama, home of the birthplace of the Confederacy, place where 299 lynchings had taken place in the 20th century, and a place where this young man knew that he faced the threat of death for speaking out in the way he was about to. That young man was Martin Luther King, of course, 26 years old at the time. And when King found out that day, on December 5th, that he was going to be the person giving the speech at the first community meeting after the arrest of Rosa Parks, his initial reaction was, why me? He was not looking to become an activist. He was not looking to become a leader of any movement. He was certainly not looking to become a national figure, and he was not looking to risk his life. Just a month or two earlier, he'd been asked to become a board member of the NAACP in Alabama, and he said no, he was too busy. He was still getting used to his church in Montgomery, still getting used to the fact that he was a new father, and that he had a lot on his plate. But when the call came and they said, we need you to speak, thousands of people are gathering, awaiting instruction, what should we do? Can we all agree to stay off the buses tomorrow and to support this proposed boycott? It was just a proposed boycott at this point. Nobody had taken any action yet. They turned to this kid, this 26-year-old. Why this kid? Well, mostly because he was new in town and he hadn't made any enemies yet. And he had a reputation for being a pretty good speaker. So Martin Luther King gets this news, and he has 20 minutes to rush home and write a speech for what he calls the biggest speech of his life. He rushes in the door, tells Coretta that he's just agreed to do something. He's not exactly sure what it even is. And he's got 20 minutes to come up with something to say to these people who are waiting for his words. And he goes back to his office in the back of the parsonage, and he has a panic attack. He can barely breathe, much less jot notes. He likes to have about 8 hours to prepare for a sermon, usually. He's never given a political speech like this before. So the first 10 minutes of the 20 minutes are gone, panic attack. He gathers his thoughts, jots a few notes, and rushes out to the driveway where Ralph Abernathy is picking him up, hops in Ralph's car. They start driving to Holt Street Baptist Church, which is the biggest church in Montgomery and can hold the most people. And he can't even get there because half a mile from the church, the streets are blocked, traffic is jammed, people are filling the streets, people have abandoned their cars in the middle of the road. And it takes King a moment to process that this is for him, that all these people are congealing to wait to see what he has to say about what they should do tomorrow. And when King finally gets to the church, by some accounts, he had to be lifted, body surfed to reach the pulpit. He gets up there and gives the speech that really defines his voice, defines the message that he's going to give to America, defines the message that we are still trying to hear and wrestle with today. He says that the black people of America may be the ones to finally help this country fulfill the promise of democracy, fulfill the words in the Declaration of Independence. He says it may be the people who've been treated worst by this country are the ones who are best prepared to lead and to show the way. And if we are wrong in what we are doing here today, then the Constitution is wrong. If we are wrong, the Bible is wrong. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. And with those words, he combines things that almost every American can agree on, the Bible and the Constitution, in calling on us to be better people. And that's the moment that King becomes king. He doesn't even know what's about to happen, and he can't possibly be prepared for what's ahead. But my goal in writing this book that took me 6 years, was to figure out what made him the perfect man for that moment and how he kept it up as he went along, how he continued in spite of incredible opposition, in spite of incredible resentment, anger, hostility, backlash, how he kept that faith going. And my pursuit began, as I mentioned, 6 years ago, when I was talking to Dick Gregory. I was interviewing him for my Muhammad Ali book, and we were sitting in a hotel restaurant in Washington, D.C., and Gregory said to me, you know the difference, and Dick Gregory, for those of you who don't know, was a legendary comedian and activist. He said, you know the difference between Martin Luther King and Jesus? And I thought it was maybe he set me up for a joke, because that's, Dick Gregory. So I just kept my mouth shut. And he said, the difference is that we've got videotape of Martin Luther King. We know he was real. We know what he said and what he did, and nobody can deny it. Those are the facts. And that really hit me hard. And what also hit me hard was that Dick Gregory knew Martin Luther King Jr. very well, spent a lot of time with him. King visited him in jail when Dick Gregory was incarcerated for some of the protests he was leading in Detroit. Dick Gregory was shot during the LA riots when Martin Luther King was there. It hit me in that moment that there were still scores, hundreds of people perhaps, who knew King really well who were still with us. And that's where I began. It was in that moment that I said, I don't even know if I'm going to write a book. At that point, I hadn't figured out how long it had been since the last book. I subsequently discovered that it had been 35 years since the last King biography. But I am going to spend the next few years of my life interviewing the people who knew Martin Luther King. Whatever comes of it, comes of it. And I began traveling the country. Thank goodness I thought of this well before COVID started, and interviewing people like Dick Gregory, Andrew Young, Harry Belafonte, Juanita Abernathy, but also interviewing the people who probably most of us haven't heard of who knew King, like his barber in Montgomery, Nelson Malden, like his childhood friend, June Dobbs Butts, who told me the funniest MLK joke I've ever heard that I cannot repeat here tonight, but maybe later when there's no chance of being recorded, I'll tell you June Dobbs' MLK joke. But I realized that I had an opportunity and that it was important to try to bring King into the public discussion again in a way that had been missing for a long time. And of course, there have been many wonderful books written about King, some of them quite recent, TV shows, documentaries, movies. But in the process of really my lifetime, in the last 50 or 60 years, we've seen his message watered down. We've seen his story reduced to something like a fairy tale. And in the process of doing that, we have lost sight of him as a human being. We've lost sight of the fact that he struggled, that he chewed his fingernails, that he suffered from depression, that he twice as an adolescent attempted suicide. We've lost sight of the fact that he had emotions, that he struggled, that he had doubts, that even some of his closest friends had doubts in him at times. We've lost sight of the fact that he was a person going through this. And then when we lose sight of the fact that he was a person, we lose sight of his true greatness, because we can't possibly imagine walking in his shoes. We can't possibly imagine picking up a torch and fighting for a cause that we believe in if we all have to be perfect. None of us are. So I began my quest there with the interviews. And I was very fortunate, as I said, to begin during COVID, but also one of the sort of surprise benefits was that when COVID did hit, all these old folks who had traveled around the country to meet were now stuck at home. And they were so happy when the phone rang. And I could talk to Dr. Butts, and I could talk to Reverend James Lawson and Reverend Dr. Bernard Lafayette, sometimes every day. I would call them, every day for a week or two at a time, or with Reverend Lawson, I would make an appointment to call him every Tuesday evening, and we would just chat. And they were so happy to have someone listening, and just, again, as I said, to have someone to talk to during COVID. But what I began to really appreciate is that King's struggle has been misunderstood. And it goes way back. It goes way back even to understanding his roots. One of the other discoveries I made, so I made had a lot of wonderful interviews, but there were important archival discoveries as well. The first biography of Martin Luther King was Lawrence Dunbar Reddick, who was an archivist living in Montgomery at the time of the Montgomery bus boycotts. And he wrote the first book about King, the first biography, in 1958, before King had even left Montgomery for Atlanta. And I found all of his papers. He stayed with King and became the official archivist for the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He stayed with King for the rest of his life, documenting every moment, every meeting, writing down the songs that were sung in church every time King spoke. And his papers were at the Schomburg Library in Harlem. The boxes had not been opened yet. I discovered Daddy King's, Martin Luther King Sr.'s autobiography, unpublished. There were only 2 copies in the world, and the King Center didn't know they had one of those copies until I asked them to go look. I discovered tapes that Coretta made. Coretta began working on her memoir right after King's death, and she sat down with a ghostwriter and recorded her memories. And as a result of that, the ghostwriter kept possession of those tapes all these years, and I found them in the ghostwriter's collection at the University of Florida. So there was this amazing new collection of material. I'd like to begin by telling you a little bit about King's journey and how some of those new materials helped me to better understand him. The Martin Luther King Sr. autobiography tells the story of a young man. Martin Luther King Sr. was 12 years old when he walked off the farm in Stockbridge, Georgia. His parents were sharecroppers. They were working for a white family, and as was typical for sharecroppers in the South at the time, had no chance to own the land, much less profit from it, because whatever they earned, turned out the rent was just a little bit more that year. And Martin Luther King Sr., at the age of 12, having seen what this had done to his parents, had turned his father into an alcoholic and a violent man, decided that the only way was to get out. And so many African-American people at the time were making that same decision, moving north. This was around 1910, 1912. And he leaves not for the north, but for Atlanta, the nearest big city. And in Atlanta, he teaches himself to read and write, teaches himself to preach, and declares that he's going to be a preacher, declares that he's going to marry the daughter of one of the city's most prosperous and famous and respected preachers, Alberta Williams. And his friends tease him and say, "You're not in love with her. She doesn't even know who you are. You just want that church." And he said, "Well, I want both." And he did. He married this incredibly intelligent, forceful, warm and loving woman, Alberta Williams, and made it possible for the next generation to do what his son and what so many other activists in the 1960s would do. Made it possible to imagine that they could make a way out of no way, as Langston Hughes put it, Zora Neale Hurston put it, and also to really embrace the concept of the black social gospel, which was such an important part of life in the South and life for black Americans, because what it said was that as long as the Bible and American society are in conflict, we have a responsibility to do something about that. It's not just enough to pray to save our souls. We have to pray and we have to work to change our country. And that's the philosophy in which Martin Luther King Jr. is raised. So in a way, he's very unusual because, and a lot of his friends, people I interviewed, said he didn't seem as bruised by racism as many of the others of our generation, because he grew up with the protection of the church around him. He grew up with in a family that had enough money, that couldn't be fired from their jobs, with an intellectual environment, and with the belief drummed into his head day after day that we could do better and we had a responsibility to do something better. So by the time King gets to Montgomery in 1955, again, he's not looking to be an activist, but this has been really drilled into him from an early age that he has a responsibility. And he tells Coretta, when he meets her in college, that he's going to go down south and kill Jim Crow when he graduates. And I think the reason that Coretta signs up for this journey, and also the reason that I think Martin Luther King is attracted to Coretta, and we should say, to be perfectly honest, that Martin Luther King had a lot of girlfriends in college, in high school even, and June Dobbs Butts, her sister was one of them, and June's best friend was actually engaged to ML, as she called him. So June knew the family history and knew ML's romantic history quite well. But I think the reason that Martin Luther King Jr. chooses Coretta of all these women that he dated is because she was an activist. In fact, when they met in Boston, She had more experience as an activist than he did. She'd gone to Antioch College, an integrated school. She'd been involved in protests on campus. She'd been to the Progressive Party National Convention. So when King says, if you marry me, we're going to go down south and kill Jim Crow, Coretta's not sure about this because she has ambitions of her own to become a concert singer, and she's not going to be able to do that in the South. But she signs on for it because she believes in the cause, and she believes in the principle, and she believes, as King does, that the Bible calls on them to do this work. So Montgomery's a great success. They stay off those buses, inspired by King's words, inspired by his message, for more than a year, until the NAACP forces the city to buckle, and the buses are integrated. And the great question now for King, and he writes to a letter to one of his college professors, is that, what do I do now? At the age of now, he's 27, he's accomplished more than most people will in a lifetime. It's a hard act to follow, and he feels the stress of this. He's not sure what to do next. There's no game plan for this, but a lot of people have come together around him in Montgomery. They've come because they see the potential that this young man has, and it's a special kind of gift that he's got. It's hard to imagine that anyone else, if they'd chosen even Ralph Abernathy, another brilliant, inspiring speaker, another brilliant and courageous man to lead the Montgomery bus boycott, would the same thing have happened? Would the civil rights movement have taken off the way it had? I'm not so sure, because King had a unique set of gifts. I just came from the American Revolution Museum early this afternoon. George Washington had this unique set of gifts, and King not only spoke the language of the South, he knew how to appeal to the members of his congregation. He was born and raised from the South. His parents and grandparents were farmers, but he'd been educated in the North. He was an intellectual. He understood the philosophy. He could speak in a way that appealed to black and white people at the same time. He'd lived in the North. He'd seen the different kind of racism and segregation there. He understood things in a way that very few people did. He had a kind of a breadth of experience. And he was a magnet for the news media, the TV reporters. They all began covering some of the civil rights struggle. It wasn't even called that yet, because King was so compelling a figure. And he was the first person they all went to. As a result of that, the activists and the media are all saying, what do we do next? How do we take the Montgomery movement and magnify it, multiply it over and over around the country? And King doesn't know either. And this is one of the things I love about him. At every step of the way, in every moment of his career, he's making it up as he goes along, guided by his faith that if he tries, if he keeps going, if he believes, something good will happen. So he goes to places like St. Augustine, to Albany, Georgia, and tries to lead protests that echo what they did in Montgomery, but it doesn't work in those first couple of tries. He starts the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but he's not sure what it's actually going to do. He doesn't know whether it should be a membership organization, how they're going to raise money, but he's trying. He gets to Birmingham, and he's failing there too. And this is really, some people think it's the last stand for Martin Luther King, because he struck out in his last two attempts, and the Birmingham boycotts, protests are not going well at all, until they recruit children to start protesting to get arrested. Very controversial. Even, Malcolm X says, I would never go that far. You don't put your children on the line like that. And yet, the response to that is Bull Connor and the police dogs and the water cannons, and that is what elicits the sympathy of America. That's what gets Americans, white Americans in particular, politicians, that's what gets John F. Kennedy to start to pay attention and to believe that maybe it's time to get off their rear ends and to think seriously about federal policy change. And that's when King suddenly finds his second wave of success. And we see King moving from Birmingham to the March on Washington. We just celebrated yesterday the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. And we see King really coalescing. And that, let's pause for a moment to think about that, because we've all just seen it on the news, the I Have a Dream speech. What was so powerful about the I Have a Dream speech, of course, the speech itself was wonderful, but King had given many wonderful speeches. In fact, he'd given the I Have a Dream speech just a couple months earlier in Detroit, exact same speech. What was so powerful about it was that you saw black and white Americans coming together peacefully after the scenes of rioting and scenes of police brutality, I should say, not rioting, but police brutality, police assault on peaceful protesters in Birmingham. And here we have people coming together in harmony and it's televised. For the first time, millions of Americans across the country are seeing black protesters engaging in a peaceful, loving moment, and what they're saying is that we're not here to tear down American society. We're not here to fight the system. We're here to join and improve American society. And there's this moment of great hope in America at that time. And I interviewed people who talked about how that moment affected them. I interviewed a guy who, at that point, was afraid to tell his coworkers that he was married to an African-American woman, but after the March on Washington, put on his wedding ring and put a picture of his wife on his desk. I talked to people who said they felt like they had to go and try to integrate their workplaces after listening to that speech. And yet, every time in American history we've seen this moment of hope and progress when it comes to race, there's this terrible backlash. And what happened the day after Martin Luther King gave his speech at the March on Washington? He goes the same day, that day, he goes and meets with John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy talks to him about putting forth civil rights legislation. But the next day, an FBI agent high in the ranks produces a memo to J. Edgar Hoover that says, given the powerful oratory, the demagogic oratory of King's speech yesterday, we now must rate him as the most dangerous man in America when it comes to race. The most dangerous man in America. Let's pause and think about what's dangerous about him. He's a pacifist. He's preaching Christian love. Maybe there's a bit of a radical element to his Christianity. There certainly is. He's preaching the Constitution. Why is he dangerous? Well, in one sense, J. Edgar Hoover is absolutely right. He is a danger to the establishment. He's a danger to the existing power structure. He's a danger to what Lerone Martin calls the white Christian nationalist ethic of J. Edgar Hoover. And maybe correctly, J. Edgar Hoover sees that nobody is better positioned to unite America in tearing down the prejudices and the systemic racism that is keeping a certain class of citizen in a secondary position. And from that moment on, the FBI begins to wiretap the associates of King's phone, of King, and soon after that begins to wiretap King's home phone and his office. And those approvals were signed by RFK with the approval of JFK. And after a little while, now, Hoover's main concern was that King was associating with communists. And in fact, there were many former communists in the civil rights movement, including several of King's close associates, Stan Levison, Bayard Rustin, and others. There were also former communists, working in Congress and probably clerking for Supreme Court justices at that point. There were a lot of former communists in America at that time. But as they began listening to King's phone calls with people like Rustin and Levison, it became clear almost immediately that they were not talking about any communist plots, and that there was certainly King's interest had nothing to do with anything related to communism, and these former communists were not talking about communism in any way. So why did the wiretaps continue? Well, they continued in large part, because they happened to hear King talking to women on the phone who were not his wife. And that became an obsession of J. Edgar Hoover, but not just J. Edgar Hoover. And I should point out another one of the discoveries I made in my research. Another one of King's biographers, David Garrow, said to me, have you thought about checking LBJ's secretary's files? Mildred Stiegel was LBJ's personal secretary, and she kept a safe in her office where she kept all of the most important and private documents. That's where she kept the tapes, because LBJ was recording most of his conversations from the Oval Office, and that's where she kept LBJ's personal financial documents. And as it turned out, thanks to David Garrow's hunch, I filed a FOIA request for any papers related to Martin Luther King in the Mildred Stiegel files. And there were more than 200 pages of documents, letters written directly from J. Edgar Hoover to LBJ, and some correspondence back from LBJ to J. Edgar Hoover, all about Martin Luther King. Hundreds of documents, sometimes 2 or 3 a week, about his personal phone calls, not about any matters of national security. King was clearly no threat to democracy. He was certainly not engaged in anything dangerous, unless, again, you're reluctant to share power. But LBJ was not only complicit, he was encouraging. At one point, he encouraged J. Edgar Hoover to leak some of the tapes of King's romantic affairs to members of the media. So what we learn from that, and I'm certainly one of the fiercest critics of J. Edgar Hoover, but it's important that we don't let others off the hook, because what we learn from the Stiegel files and from other documents that have recently been released by the FBI is that other members of the FBI were heavily engaged in this campaign to destroy King, and other members of Congress and members of the White House staff as well. And when I say destroy, I mean destroy. At one point, they sent him a letter along with a tape of his hotel rooms that they wanted Coretta to hear in the hopes that she would divorce him. And the letter said that King, the only way out for you is suicide, basically. And they were working to select a replacement for King, someone they could infiltrate, someone they could place in as the leader of the civil rights movement. So King knows all this is going on and continues the fight, goes from Birmingham to Selma, to Montgomery, to Chicago, and over again, he's told by his advisors, you need to back off. You're hurting the cause, especially when he starts talking about Northern racism and Northern segregation, and when he starts talking about Vietnam. His closest advisors, people who we thought were to the left of him, like Bayard Rustin and Stan Levison, are saying, just stick to voting rights in the South. Why doesn't King listen? He's been stabbed in the chest already. His home has been bombed. The entire federal government is conspiring to destroy him. If he could just back off a little bit, he might have one fewer enemy. He might make his life a little bit easier. At this point, he could even, he could take some time. He could go on a retreat and write a book. He's won the Nobel Peace Prize. He could easily say, it's time for me to hand this off. He's even starting to get criticized by younger black protesters, by younger black activists who feel like he's too conservative, that he's the leader of the past, and that he's no longer in touch with the people. And yet King perseveres. He never stops. In fact, he doubles down over and over again. And it's because of his beliefs. It's because it's all rooted in the Bible. I did an event with the Bishop of Washington, D.C., and she said, I've watched some of your interviews, and every time you ask what was King most motivated by, you say Jesus. And I say, yeah. And she says, well, that's really nice for someone like me to say, but when a white Jewish journalist says it, that's pretty cool. And it's just painfully obvious to me that he cannot. There's this conversation he has with Stan Levison. So on April 4th, 1967, King gives what I consider his greatest speech. It's the Beyond Vietnam speech. It's at the Riverside Church in New York. And he really sums up his entire life's meaning, his beliefs. And he says, I've been told to stop speaking out on things like Northern racism. I've been told to stop speaking out on the Vietnam War. But I can't call for peace and tranquility when Los Angeles is going up in flames if I don't also call out police brutality, and if I don't call out the greatest purveyor of violence on earth, the United States government with its war in Vietnam. I cannot be true to myself. I cannot be true to my God if I don't speak out on these issues, regardless of how it affects me personally. And the next day, he gets a call from Stan Levison. And we know exactly what King said because the FBI was listening to the call, and we can read the transcript. And King says, Levison says, I didn't like that speech. And Levison has been one of his closest friends and advisors for 13 years now. He says, it didn't sound like you. And it's going to destroy your relationship, whatever's left of it, with the president, and it's going to hurt our fundraising. And you can, again, we're only reading a transcript, but you can almost hear the pain in King's voice because he says, don't you know me? Haven't you been listening to anything I've been saying all these years? What I did might have been politically unwise, but it was not morally unwise. And from that moment on, this is a year before his assassination, King begins thinking how he can go even bigger and broader and how he can commit even more deeply to his beliefs. He begins working on what he calls the Poor People's Campaign. Today we might call it Occupy Washington, because he's going to bring thousands of people, mostly poor people, all different races. Vietnam protesters are welcome. Everyone is welcome, and they're going to occupy Washington, D.C. in a squatters camp until the president and members of Congress agree to fundamental economic reforms. It's not about civil rights anymore, it's about human rights, King says. And they are going to commit themselves to this, and he will stay there as long as it takes until the government realizes that we cannot keep going in the direction we're going. And it's not going well for King in trying to organize this. He's having a hard time recruiting, he's having a hard time raising money. And again, some of his closest advisors are saying, let's just go back to working on voting rights. And he won't do it. And then his good friend, Reverend James Lawson, one of the people I talked to dozens of times in researching this book, calls him and asks him if he'll come to Memphis because there's a garbage workers' strike. And his advisors again say, that's small potatoes. You've got bigger problems. You've thrown yourself into these anti-war protests. You're trying to, we've got a month to go before the Poor People's Campaign, and we've only got 300 people signed up to show up there. You can't go to Memphis. But King sees it differently. He sees this as a call to help the working class, to help the people who are being mistreated, the almost entirely black team of sanitation workers who have no benefits, who are working in unsafe conditions. And he feels like, yeah, he's busy, he's got other things, but he's called to do this. And he goes to Memphis, of course, as we all know. And he's struggling terribly at this point. You can hear him again in these phone calls. He feels like people aren't listening to him anymore, that he's losing his power, that his message is being lost. And your heart goes out to him. And Andy Young told me that he thought King was clinically depressed at that point, and they were urging him to take a sabbatical, to consider, seeing a psychiatrist, and King wouldn't do it. He was just too driven, and he was too worried about what would happen if the word got out that he was seeing a shrink. And it's terribly sad to think about what he was going through in those last years. But I want to end on a more positive note, because when King goes to Memphis, and in the final sermons of his life, he seems to be reflecting on the meaning of it all. He seems to be looking back on his life. And of course, we all know his famous farewell speech didn't know it was a farewell speech, but he says in Memphis the night before his assassination, we're trying to reach the promised land, and I have been to the mountaintop, and I've seen the promised land, but I may not get there with you, but I know we will get there together. And the next day, standing on the balcony at the Lorraine Motel, of course, as we all know, he's assassinated. And as he's standing there in the moments before he's assassinated, Jesse Jackson is down in the parking lot and joking with him, and his driver is urging him to go back and get his jacket because it's getting chilly that night. And King hears his driver's words and says, "Okay, I will." And those are the last words he ever spoke. So I wrote this book to attempt to get us to look at King again and to see him as a human being, to see him as a man with flaws. But I think when we look at those flaws, we see his courage in even starker relief. I also wrote this book to try to remind readers that the racial conditions in the 1950s and 60s are not so different in many ways from the racial conditions we live with today. And I hope that by seeing the real King, the one who believed in the power of words, the power of belief, the power of faith, who believed in the power of truth, that we might see ourselves and we might see that words and faith can still move us to goodness, and that history has the power to motivate and to inspire and to help all of us say, "Okay, I will." Thank you.
Is that possible that it was largely because when Martin Luther King started to press the anti-war issue, that became a political threat to LBJ in the way that he hadn't been threatened before by Martin Luther King? And I could see LBJ would really get wound up about a threat to his political survival. So do you think that that was, I mean, it's not an excuse, but if he wanted to undo Martin Luther King, it wasn't because of the racial progress that Martin Luther King was.
No, I agree with you.
It was because of the political stuff with the war.
No, that's a great question. And I don't think that LBJ was complicit because he wanted to hurt the civil rights movement. I think that, first of all, some of it was voyeuristic, and LBJ, we know, loved having information on anybody, friends or foes, that he might use at any time politically. That's how, I guess, good politicians operate. The more you know about your friends and your foes, the more power you have, and LBJ was, of course, the master power broker. And he was, of course, but he was, let's be clear, that the wiretaps were authorized and reauthorized many times before MLK began speaking out on the Vietnam War. I absolutely believe that once King began to speak out on the war, it infuriated LBJ, and that LBJ did become more obsessed and perhaps more malevolent toward King. Yeah, it did hurt LBJ politically, and LBJ was having psychological problems of his own. He was haunted by what was going on in Vietnam and was convinced that it was going to destroy his legacy and that it was going to lead to Bobby Kennedy getting elected president, which was his greatest nightmare because he hated Bobby Kennedy. So there was a lot going on. And it's just another example, as with King, you know, our great moral leader who had his moral failings. LBJ is probably our greatest president on civil rights, and he's also a foe of MLK and someone who's still trying to control the civil rights movement to keep it, you know, at least somewhat under his control, or at least, you know, aware of what's going on within the civil rights movement.
First and foremost, I love the Ali book.
Thank you.
Great. My question's on the relationship or the friendship between Stokely Carmichael and Dr. King. Obviously, it was 2 years, but was it a lasting friendship? Did they have a falling out at any time?
That's a really good question. One of the things I love about King is that he engages in a really warm way with people who he might have reason to resent. And Stokely Carmichael is, like Malcolm X in a way, is using King as a foil to say, I'm the younger, cooler, more radical civil rights activist here. And when King goes to Mississippi for the Meredith March, once again his advisors are saying, don't go, but he goes. And he's marching every day with Stokely Carmichael and engaged in these fascinating conversations. And Carmichael, who at that point was a little bit skeptical of King, like a lot of other younger black leaders, they teasingly called him DeLord, as if he was this old man on high. And but Carmichael kind of fell in love with him as they walked. And he tells a story about seeing, like, way off in the distance as they're marching down this dirt road, like some figures on the horizon. He's not even sure if it's people. And he finally gets there, and there's two old African-American farmers standing by the side of the road. They've just been waiting there in the heat all afternoon to try to see Martin Luther King. And when they get there, you know, the couple can barely speak. They're in such awe, and King immediately, like, charms them and has them joking and telling stories. And Carmichael was just really moved by King's ability and just at how much he meant to the average African-American person at that time in history, especially the older folks. And King listened and absorbed. You can see how King's speeches start to change a little bit after his time with Stokely. And at one point, Stokely Carmichael is comfortable enough. He says to King, you know, Doc, that I've been using you. And King just laughs. He has that great laugh and says, "Well, yes, I've been used before, and I'll be used again. You do what you've got to do." And I think they had a really great mutual respect, and I don't think it ever faded. I think that they remained friends for, you know, the couple of years that King had left after that. And Stokely was almost like, in a funny way, trying to trick King to say Black Power, just to say the words Black Power, and King wouldn't say it, but he began using the word power in his speeches a lot more after that. I think Stokely had an impact.
Thank you for a brilliant book. We all enjoyed it immensely. Could you focus a little bit on Dr. King's relationship with Gandhi and the pacifist approach?
Yes, King never met Gandhi, of course, but he traveled to India and spent several weeks there with Coretta, touring the country and meeting disciples, meeting family members. And he knew Gandhi beforehand, of course. He'd studied him in college, but he was not really fully committed to Gandhi's concepts of nonviolent protest until the Montgomery bus boycott began, and Bayard Rustin came down to see him. And Rustin was one of the first, more established, more experienced protesters to get there, and said, you're talking about Gandhi in some of your speeches, but you've still got a gun in the house. That's really not going to work. And he talked to King about going more deeply and committing more deeply to nonviolence. And I think King absolutely embraced it, but I think some of the Christian theologians were probably even greater influences.
I just think it must have taken a certain boldness to write this book, because Dr. King was such an important figure, and a lot of things had been written. And then I think about you gathering all this information and interviewing all these people. I really have no idea how you brought it all together.
I'm not sure either.
But I think, as you said, things have changed since Dr. King's effort, but we still face serious racism. And I'm thinking, with the time you spent, you probably have a rather clear analysis of how far we've come. You think about Dr. King saying, I might not get there with you, but I can see it. And I wonder where you are on that. Where are we between Dr. King and the Promised Land?
Well, I asked that question a lot to the people I was interviewing. I'm not really, I don't feel like I'm an expert on today's affairs. I think it's safe to say that we've made a lot of progress and we have a lot of work still to do, and that many of the things King warned us about, many of the reasons that he said he felt like his dream had turned into a nightmare just in the few years since he gave that speech, is because we've not made the progress in the areas that he warned us were going to be the most difficult. We still see my city, Chicago, is as deeply segregated as it ever was. We still see, obviously, police brutality, perhaps even worse than it was in King's day. And he talked about these things in the I Have a Dream speech. We forget that the first half of that speech, he talked about police brutality, he talked about reparations, he talked about income inequality. We just like to talk about, judging people by the content of their character, because that's easier, it goes down easier, it's, candy-coated. But we need to remember that King warned us, and the speech he was planning to give, the sermon he was planning to give the Sunday after his assassination, had he lived, was called "America May Go to Hell." So he was not optimistic, and but he was, as Andrew Young said to me many times, he was sure as heck never going to quit. He was going to keep working at it, and some people felt like, well, he was so depressed that maybe he was looking for a way out, but no, I don't believe that. Hi.
I'm just curious, did you discover anything about King that genuinely surprised you?
Oh, wow. There were a lot of things that surprised me. I'll give you sort of a big example and a little example. The little example, in 1939, the Hollywood premiere of Gone with the Wind was in Atlanta. And Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh flew on a private plane, and it was the biggest event to hit Atlanta since, Sherman probably. And the whole city, this was, the city was going all out for this. And they planned a giant premiere. Of course, black people were not invited to the premiere, but they were asked to serve as waiters and waitresses and valets. And King's church was invited, Daddy King's church was invited to perform in the choir at this Hollywood premiere, to sing for the white guests. And most black religious leaders would not do it. In fact, they begged Daddy King not to do it. But Daddy King decided to send his church to perform at the premiere. And there's a picture of the Ebenezer Choir, and in the middle of the choir was a group of about 12 children dressed as enslaved children, and Martin Luther King is one of them, sitting there in the front row, age 10, singing at the Hollywood premiere of Gone with the Wind. So just blows your mind. That's one of the small, little details. And I loved hearing those kinds of stories about, from his barber, about the fact that he wasn't a great tipper. Things like that. He and Ralph Abernathy always wore the same cologne and wore the same Aramis and wore the same shoes. Stacey Brown. And on the bigger side, I was deeply disappointed to see how unfaithful he was to Coretta, and how difficult that must have been for her, and also just to see how he really missed an opportunity to involve women more in the civil rights movement, including Coretta, who begged him over and over to get more involved, to let her be more active in the movement. And again, he's one of our greatest, most progressive fighters for equality, but he had his blind spots, and sexism was one of those blind spots, I'm afraid. So that's just the first couple things that come to mind.
Well, first, thank you so very much. In reading the book and reading it again, it occurs to me that what you've done is help us understand the man, his personality, his moods, infidelities. Do you conclude that his father is the key role model and key influencer? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. I think, again, beyond Jesus, his father was probably the biggest role model. And then, of course, like most of us, that means partly trying to defy your father, trying to exceed your father, trying to be different from your father. Because King's father was a great, brave civil rights fighter in his own right, but he was also a kid off the farm who didn't speak great English and who preached in this very emotional style. And I think in response to that, King wants to go to seminary and wants to get a doctorate. He wants to be a more intellectually polished kind of a preacher than his father. And when his father comes to Montgomery, by the way, when the house is bombed for the first time, and says, "You're getting out of here. You've got a baby to take care of. You're not going to risk your life for this." King has a very hard time saying no to his father, but he finds a way. He always finds a way without saying no to resist his father and to push beyond what his father wants him to do. So that struggle, I think, between him and his father is something that really absolutely is one of the central forces in his life. Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between Dr. King and Bayard Rustin? Bayard Rustin is obviously more well-known today. He's co-organizer of the March on Washington. But the relationship between Dr. King and Bayard Rustin is one we all should know about, because he was heavily criticized for keeping him.
Yes.
And if you could go into some detail on this relationship, because what that shows, again, to me, that Dr. King was a moral person. A moral person and not so much a political person, just like he was in the Vietnam War speech, and then going north, fight racism in the north.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. It's worth noting that when JFK pulled King aside and said, "You've got to cut ties with these former communists," King said, "They're my friends, I trust them." And in the case of Bayard Rustin, it was particularly acute because he was out as a gay man. And that was very unusual at that time. And it's interesting that King, who had these prejudices when it came to women and their roles in society, was able to overcome whatever prejudices he might have had around a gay man, and kept Bayard Rustin not only in his inner circle, but really relied on him heavily. And that's in part because Rustin was such a compelling, dynamic, brilliant figure, also because he really complemented King in that King had no experience as an organizer at that point. He had experience as an orator, as a minister, but he had no idea how to lead an organization, how to raise money, how to rally a community support. And Rustin was a genius for all of those things, which is why Rustin was the man largely responsible for putting together the March on Washington, maybe the only man in America who could have pulled it off. So it is a great example of King being open-minded, overcoming his prejudices, and recognizing talent. I wish he'd been that wise to recognize Ella Baker's talent and to put her in charge of the SCLC when he had the opportunity. But yes, credit where credit is due, absolutely.
Did King, was he aware of, by any chance, of the amazing explosion of influence that African American music from the United States would possibly have on the world as it is today? Did he speak about that at all, or?
You know, I don't know that I ever saw him speak directly about that, but he was absolutely well aware of the influence of music and culture and how black artists, writers, singers, actors had paved the way for him. Athletes, too, I should say. You know, he said Jackie Robinson was essential, that the civil rights movement would not have happened if Jackie Robinson hadn't broken the color line in baseball. But more importantly, in a way, figures like Jackie Robinson, like Harry Belafonte, like Louis Armstrong, even, you know, a generation earlier, had made white Americans almost sort of subconsciously open their minds that there might be more to this community than they were aware of, so that by the time the civil rights movement began, some of them had already been trained, their minds had been trained and made more open. And then, of course, he realized the absolute power that those figures had to help raise money and to unite the community. So Sammy Davis Jr. and Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, and then their ability to bring in white influencers. You know, King was very savvy about recognizing that one way to transcend the civil rights movement, to take people who are not necessarily ready to get out and march, is to say, hey, well, if you come to the march, well, look, what's his name? Marlon Brando's going to be there, so why wouldn't you be there too? And the March on Washington is a great example of that. You know, look at the star power that was there that day. So, well, thank you all very much for coming tonight.